Good morning. It's a bright, sunny day out here in Barrio Capitolio, Pasig City, Metro Manila, Philippines. Welcome to the program Agenda. I'm your host, your Kuya Cito Beltran, welcoming you today on this November 10, 2022, Thursday. Isang tulog na lang. Happy weekend na naman kayo. How time flies, and I hope you are making the most of it. Welcome to the program. Thank you to all Cignal TV subscribers. Maraming salamat po. You give us reason to get out of bed, to wake up, and to do our jobs well. We hope that the agenda is delivering to your expectations. And thank you also to those of you who watch us on Facebook and on YouTube. Hanapin nyo lang sa facebook.com/onenewsph, also for YouTube. And thank you for those who download the Cignal Play app. Let's move on with our daily starter. This is a very good reminder, our daily starter, because many of us go through life, I want to do this, maybe I should do that, natatakot lang ako, or you want to take up a career, do a project, pursue a hobby, but you are worried because it might cost you so much, or it may consume too much of your time, or you would have to give up some things, and you can what you end up doing is you convince yourself out of your dream or your idea. And here comes our daily starter from Mr. Tim Grover. If you think the price of winning is too high, wait till you get the bill from regret. Okay, yan po, no? Wait till you get the bill from regret. Ano bang ibig sabihin yan? Many of us say, I can't afford it. You know, it's hard, it's difficult. I'm 66 years old, and I waited until this year to take up piano lessons as part of my bucket list, because for 2 generations, none of the Beltran have been able to, in our family, have been able to play a musical instrument. Unfortunately, now that I've decided to pursue it, and which I am doing, I also have the handicap of osteoarthritis on my left ring finger. So it is a very painful experience, but nonetheless, I do it. I think what will happen to me is I can at least say I did it. Some of you may go to your grave and say, I should have done this, I should have done that. That is the bill. Yun po yung singil ng pagsisisi. Okay, so let's now go to the front page of the Philippine Star, and let's find out what's in store. The headline goes, quote, Bantag livid over Lapid house visit, Remulla. According to DOJ Secretary Crispin Boying Remulla, the General Gerald Bantag was very livid upon learning that radio commentator Percy Lapid had visited his house in Laguna last September. Okay, this is regarding the expose that Percy Lapid made referring to the Cinderella Man, and there you have that photo. Kinuha niya po yung video na yan nung bahay ni General Gerald Bantag, and proceeded to say that he lived in a mansion and had 11 cars. Now, the problem there is, according to General Bantag, he was just renting that house, and most of the 11 cars were cars of the Bilibid National Penitentiary. So, ayun po. Okay, anyway, that's the headline. The Secretary of Justice is simply establishing the reason why General Gerald Bantag is the principal suspect in all of this investigation. Okay, now the header of the front page, labor group seeks wage hike amid inflation. Okay, several labor groups are now pushing for salary increases because of the severe inflation, food inflation, etc. And they are also asking for employment guarantees. Pag-uusapan natin yan today with our guests, and please stick around because this is going to be a very educational episode, I am sure. Big photo at the top of the front page is a photo of, I believe this is aluminum and metal, pangkalakal. Pangkalakal po yan, okay, which was recovered on the coast of Barangay Poblacion in Calintaan Occidental, Mindoro, suspected or believed to be part of the Chinese rocket that was launched a month or two ago. Okay, yon, ini-inspect na siya ng Philippine Coast Guard, and kaswerte ng makakakuha niyan panggagawing pang-jeepney. Okay, anyway, Meralco rates up slightly this month. Customers of Manila Electric Company, Meralco, will see a slight increase of 0.084 per kilowatt an hour. Barya-barya lang pala. Hindi pa nga barya. So, in their November bills on account of higher generation charge, the bill's largest component. Yan po, okay? So, tipid-tipid lang ng konti, but the rate increase is very small. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice wants autopsy on 120 NBP cadavers. Okay, it was stated in the news last night that Secretary Boying Remulla is suggesting that the 120 remains or cadavers of deceased prisoners of the National Bilibid Penitentiary be brought to the UP PGH Barao. Sabi nila UP PGH initially, but apparently it will be brought to the University of the Philippines College of Medicine. It seems that there was a miscommunication. Boying Remulla was talking about giving the cadavers with permission of relatives to the UP College of Medicine for their anatomy and autopsy classes. Ang lumabas sa balita, hindi nagkaintindihan. Papa-autopsy daw yung 120 na mga namatay in the last year. So, ayun. So, naglinaw. The story is the DOJ wants to turn over the 120 cadavers to the UP College of Medicine. Okay, UP meanwhile leads Philippine universities in Asian rankings. Okay, yan po. Medyo maraming tumaas ang kilay because some people said, akala ba namin tinalo ng Ateneo ang UP? Ano nangyari? Well, according to another company, another group that does surveys and assessments, the University of the Philippines remains to be the top university in the Philippines, okay? However, ito po yung malungkot, okay? Allow me to read this if you would. While still the only Philippine institution in the top 100, UP dropped 10 notches from 77th place last year to 87 in this year's list. It ranked 69 in 2020 and 72nd in 2019. So, bumagsak pa rin ang Philippines in terms of Asian ranking. Ateneo de Manila University, which overtook UP in a separate university rankings released by London-based Times Higher Education last month, also dropped 10 spots from 124th to 134. Sa madaling sabi, maraming universities in the Philippines dropped several notches in the rankings, and iba-iba po. There are very different reasons for the grading because some grade you on facilities, the degrees held by professors, the kind of population to facility ratio, papers that the university produce, etc. Okay, moving forward. Ito, sana meron kayo, kamag-anak niyo ito sa Amerika. One winner, isa lang ang nanalo ng record $2 billion US Powerball jackpot. Okay? Ayun, a single ticket sold in California scooped an eye-watering $2 billion on Tuesday after a delayed draw in the US lottery. Okay. Ayun po. So, and then last but not the least, the Ortigas Mall kicks off the 2022 Green Hills Night Market to welcome, okay, the holiday season. Yan po. Kasi magkakasama na yung mga politiko ng San Juan at mga officials ng Ortigas Company and celebrities. Okay. Paalaala lang po, a request to all of you who are going to go to these places, especially those of you who like to go to Tiange. Double up on your mask. Try to keep your social distance. And be careful because COVID is still with us. And yung mga ganyang lugar, yung mga Tiange, mga public markets is where you are more likely to get COVID than in any other place. Let's now go to our main portion of the program where we interview experts, personalities, authorities, as well as celebrities to tell us or what they know or share their knowledge on the subject matter at hand. And as I mentioned, today the subject matter, it revolves around inflation, its impact on our disposable income or salaries, and its impact on workers, okay? Or sa mga regular Filipinos. Let's roll out our introduction for one of our regular associates na. Hindi na ito guest eh. Associate na ito ng agenda. Gabriel, roll out the Betamax.
Sonny Africa is the executive director of IBON Foundation, a non-profit focused on providing socio-economic research and analysis on various issues in the country. He is also a board member of the independent media outfit Alter Media. Africa obtained his bachelor's degree in philosophy and economics and master's degree in development studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science.
Okay, Sonny, good morning to you, sir.
Hi, good umaga, Sir Cito. Musta na ang piano lessons? Galing.
Ito, nagdudusa kung kailan pa may rayuma. Doon pa nagka-piano. Anyway, we asked you to join us, and I'm glad the team reached out to you because there is so much to understand regarding inflation, regarding living wages, regarding the state of employment. Kasi meron daw kayong ginawang study sa IBON where you determined that, tama ba yun, 4 out of 10 Filipinos, bagamat nagtatrabaho while they are working, are not officially or formally employed. They're either self-employed, they are working in the family business, but not really as legitimate employees. Kumbaga, may tinatanggap kay tatay, kay nanay, but they're not covered by Social Security, not covered by PhilHealth, etc. Could you, where should we start? Kasi sabi na nung ni Sonny Matula na yung sa labor na kailangan taasan ng presyo, ang sweldo hindi na namin kaya, and give us employment guarantees. Ngayon ko palang nadinig, Sonny, yung term na yun, yung employment guarantee. So could you begin with your lecture for today?
Lecture talaga. Siguro actually magandang starting point yung question about yung informality of employment in the country. Actually right now, since we're talking about wage hikes, actually more or less, it's not just 4 out of 10, more or less about 7 out of 10 of employment is actually not covered by wage orders. So this includes, of course, those in the informal sector, self-employed, domestics, family farm business you mentioned. But you also have to add, actually, most establishments aren't regulated. They aren't covered with DOLE, they're not registered, they're not reached in terms of minimum wage compliance, where they actually have quite informal, non-contractual wage and salary work. So when we're talking about wage hikes, at most, siguro, we're talking about 8 to maybe sometimes 9 or 10 million employed out of the total more or less 47, 48 million employed right now. So parang, I think it's important to put that into context kasi a lot of the alarmism about, oh no, a wage hike is going to be inflationary, it doesn't actually capture most of our productive workforce is not covered by wage orders. I mean, for better or for worse. Tapos, I think the basic point about the wage hike, which is always the problem, is can employers afford it? But I think we should also ask more often, can workers live on the wage they're receiving? And I think that's the most frustrating thing with us. IBON does give support to trade unions when they do their collective bargaining agreements or when they negotiate with the NWPC for wage hikes. One thing we've really noticed is employers never want to increase the wage. When times are good, they say if wages are increased, that's going to make the economy stumble. When times are bad, they're going to say that's going to stop the economy from recovering. And I think that's for us, it's the best starting point for any discussion with the NWPC, with the regional wage boards, or with DOLE. Parang for some reason, why is it so hard to give a higher wage despite increasing productivity, despite increasing profits? It's not actually getting reflected in people's wages. Tapos concluding point na lang po.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there, Sonny, okay? Because I know you studied abroad, you've worked abroad, etc. How different is the system in other countries compared to the Philippines? Kasi sa akin, parang pinagmumula natin, amo, senyorito, senyora, culture mga feudal culture, farms, mga family-based organizations. So talagang parang may utang na loob ka pa. You should be grateful that we give you a job, and so people will always be resistant to giving salary increases. But how do they do it in other countries? Is it through legislation? Is there formula, etc., so that employers and employees don't have to argue and shout at each other every time there is a need to increase salaries?
Well, actually, wage systems are so varied. Out of about 200 countries in the world, wage systems vary. We have, of course, as we do have in the Philippines, but that's also very different in a country like, for example, where we are right now, in Switzerland. Also very different from a country like South Africa or Brazil or India or wherever else. I think it's hard to generalize, but I think at the Philippines level of development, in terms of yung relatively low institutional capacity, meaning in terms of yung extent of legislation, the budget for the for the Labor Department to actually monitor wage hikes, I think we're more or less in the same level of maybe a country like Brazil or Argentina or perhaps even South Africa. And sa amin, the way to develop that system for better wage setting actually can be done I think South Africa is a good model. They have a legislated national minimum wage. So despite also being a large country, despite having very varied industries, despite a wide geographic discrepancies, supposedly even among job opportunities and incomes, they were able to legislate quite recently a higher national minimum wage. So I think that's something that the Philippines can aspire for, at least have a better base, kumbaga, for workers to work with. And then that actually gives strength to the workers vis-a-vis employers. And that's actually, I think, the crux of any labor debate naman eh. Where does the government side in terms of its arbitration, if it's acting as an arbiter, or in terms of the policies it makes? And I think legislation is a good way to go because it institutionalizes a certain wage level for the workers na,
Okay.
na may basic minimum.
Is the resistance to wage increases based on greed or fear and apprehension that if we give you an inch, you will want a hand? If we give you a hand, you will want an arm or a leg? Kasi may mga kumpanyang ganyan na nakakausap ko and they say, we actually want to give. But the problem is, we're in this CBA, collective bargaining agreement. If we are generous now, they will certainly demand even more in the future. In your assessment of the Philippines, is it greed on the part of the companies or is it fear and apprehension?
I don't want to speculate on motivation, but I think what's very clear, whether it's coming from greed or some kind of misplaced apprehension, the bottom line is I think employers are capitalists, and it's been studied through so many ideological lenses. Capital always wants to make a profit. So I think again, whatever the specifics of motivation, whatever's running through their heads, the bottom line is every employer, every capitalist will want to increase their stock of capital by lowering wages. And I think that's a better way to start than judging whether it's greed or apprehension. Because if you start on the reality, employers will always want to increase their profits, even at the expense of the workers. On the other hand, workers will always want to increase their wages, perhaps even with less recognition of the capacity of capital. That's where the government comes in. So I think the point about the institutionalization of a wage practice, that's why it's so important for the government, because basically they're at odds. Capital and labor will always be at odds. They'll be fighting over whatever was produced by labor, and the government has to take sides. And I think that's why it's important to have it legislated, to have clear parameters for what sets the wage. Actually, the government does have a definition of the family living wage. And then if it's legislated, wala nang away yun. One, like I said nga, yung usapin ng apprehension, may resolve kasi the parameters are clear. The benchmarks are clear. The metrics for assessing kung is it justified to raise or not are going to be there. So,
may
pero right
protection.
Now, and may clarity, di ba? Parang,
but we have wage boards all over the Philippines. What's wrong with these wage boards?
The bottom line with the wage board is supposed to be a tripartite wage system, but the tendency is the government side tends to take the side of the employer rather than the worker. So kahit na dole yan, na representative, they're not taking actually the side of the worker. Tapos one thing we do want to stress, it's very well established. There is data that will clearly show, for instance, in the last decade, labor productivity has been rising, but wages have stayed flat. And corporate profits have been increasing. So kumbaga unambiguous na yan. So para sa amin is that greed or apprehension, it's actually beside the point. The more important point is, why has government not stepped in to make sure that the benefits of workers, increased productivity, goes a bit more to the workers? It's not totally monopolized by the corporations, by the employers.
Okay, you just said a while ago that you have data over the last 10 years that labor productivity has increased, corporate profit has increased. In fact, dyan kumukulo yung dugo ko around January, February. Kasi most of the year, all of these corporate executives, members of these chambers will say, malulugi kami. And yet in January or February, they come with their annual reports where they say they had 20% increase profit year on year, etc. Sabi ko, aba, nagkakalukuhan. But my question, my next question is this. You've addressed the fundamentals. How does it affect the profitability of business when employees don't have a living wage level?
I think it will depend on the business because there's a difference between the individual self-interest of a company and the collective interest of all companies. We would rather start from a perspective na if you increase the purchasing power of workers, most workers at very low levels of income will be spending it. And most of them won't be spending it abroad. They'll be spending it in the local economy. So I think my multiplier effects of giving an increased wage hike, it may not necessarily go to the firm in particular, lalo if it's a firm producing halimbawa machinery. Of course, the average worker doesn't buy industrial machinery, but they do buy consumption goods. So para sa amin, if we separate that notion of the individual self-interest of a company and the collective versus the collective self-interest of corporations, I think collectively, corporations do have an interest to increase wages kasi that puts more money in the economy, that increases economic activity, that expands markets, giving incentive for more businesses from the consumption side to the producer side to actually increase their production. And I think that sort of narrow-mindedness of thinking that I want to keep as much money as I want for myself, that actually restricts the growth of the domestic economy. It restricts opportunities for other businesses to expand. And in the long term, that actually punishes the corporations, and of course, collectively and individually, worker families.
Yeah,
that's why the government is so important. I mean, ganong klaseng decision is always going to be hard for any individual company to make. It's going to be very anarchic and disconnected. So if the government steps in, the government can step in with a longer view, as in longer in terms of a time frame, but also a wider view in terms of the whole economy, not just individual corporations' profitability.
Okay, what about opening the economy to outside forces? Kasi, siyempre, ikaw, I don't know if you're a nationalist. I would probably qualify as a pseudo-nationalist kasi, or conditional nationalist, di ba? Where useful nationalist ako, where, detrimental. But, kasi listening to guys like you, I do the interviews every day. And I have the impression that Jurassic pa rin ang mindset ng mga businessmen, ng government officials in the country, in the sense that many of them either have the wrong attitude or don't know half of what guys like you know. Because parang yung the level of intelligence or data or information, parang in the Philippines, do we actually utilize this data to develop policies and better improve the situation? Because like I just read about UP, Ateneo, World Asian ratings, rankings, that already tells us, guys, if we don't do something about the colleges and universities in the Philippines, we will continue producing idiots because the institutions are suffering and suffering and suffering. But does the same apply to our businessmen and government? Para bang nagdadagdag ba sila ng
I think, Sir Cito, kasi the main problem is individual self-interest doesn't always sum up to the collective self-interest. And actually, a lot of times there's a disconnect. And I think that's precisely why we think it's important that something so important as wage setting shouldn't be the result of multiple CBAs. A national minimum wage where the government steps in with a longer view and a broader view is quite important to bridge that gap between very, very rational. I mean, businessmen are very smart, but they're also very rational based on their own individual self-interest, their own corporate self-interest, which is not going to be the same as the collective economic self-interest. And I think yung pinaka-expression talaga at may pinakakakayanan to manifest that collective self-interest, worker training policy, and all of that. And sa amin, that can be done. And I think if you want, good examples of that,
Yes,
a lot
please.
of Western European countries and Scandinavian countries do have that kind of setup where, because the government intervenes on a much stronger basis, it does set more long-term plans, and then it gives support to firms, but conditional on them behaving in certain ways. That's actually the way to wield and make the connection between individual self-interest and the collective good of the economy and even the corporations. And I think that guidance kasi, it won't happen spontaneously. And I think without fail, every developed country in the world that has reached some level of equity and productivity, and I think a lot of Western European countries and Scandinavian countries are a good example, it's because the government intervened and created mas far-looking institutions. Kasi kung tama kayo kung self-interest naman ng corporations, they will get as much as they want within their short time frame, even at the expense of others. Kasi other corporations actually kompetensya nila, and it's
and they don't study. They don't study. They don't rely on data technology. Unlike the big players. I mean, I know some of the big players. Talagang grabe. Ang kanilang mga research, mga policy departments, ang lalaki. So they're always, 5 years ahead of their competitors.
Oh, and exactly. I think the way the rationality and that kind of incentive of individual businesses to actually study their market, make long-term projections, that will still be there naman under whatever regime, whether the government intervenes, sets larger plans or not, where the government encourages certain industrial sectors more than others. They're always going to be like that. So para sa amin, hindi naman ito yung nakalaban, yung ganong klaseng resale ng businesses. Accept that that's how business function. They will always want to make a profit, sometimes, unfortunately, even at the expense of their workers. But if the government steps in and says, okay, kayong mga negosyo, in the Philippines, we want in 50 years' time to have a strong industrial sector. Parang ginagawa ng China. Actually, grabe, when China looks 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, and then they set the parameters and then they let individual businesses work within those long-term parameters. And I think, again, that's a good example. Kung nakatingala tayo with how China has progressed so much in the last 40, 50 years, it's because they had that combination of a long-term view imposed by the government. They set the parameters, and then, kayong mga negosyante, businesses, make as much money as you want within the parameters we set, which leads to a collective, on
the opposite side of the fence, or the reverse, the opposite of that mirror, while China was investing 20, 30, 50 years into the future, I remember what happened in the US, and I won't say I'm an economist or an authority, but when the US businessmen discovered how cheap China was, they thought they hit the pot of gold. They slowly but surely migrated manufacturing productions in China and ended up closing the factories in America and ended up putting out so many Americans out of work. Unemployment was just an all-time high. And then what happened was, when the cheap goods from China came to America, there were no buyers because everybody had gone poor.
Actually, exactly. Because what happened there, basically, American firms were operating out of their own narrow individual self-interest. When it was actually cheaper, more profitable for them to produce in China, they didn't care about the collective interests of the workers, the US economy. Habol nila individual profit, they went to China. But the reason they're going back right now, because again, good example, the US realized we should wield the self-interest of businesses, but for that self-interest to serve the American, whatever definition, the American economy, we have to give incentives for them to go back to the US, where there's tax incentives, there's subsidies.
Which is what they're doing now.
Exactly.
The Made in America motto is now being revived. Now, here in the Philippines, please correct me if I'm wrong, teach me if I'm stupid or ignorant. The biggest employer, and allow me to call them business organization, is the Philippine government. Fuel, ang unang kumita hindi pa lumalabas sa bomba, kumikita na yung gobyerno. Business, hindi mo pa natatayo yung building, yung office, yung tindahan, government, local or national. How do you correct the mentality if the government itself already functions on a profit orientation?
Well, sa amin, that's a long-term struggle. Unfortunately, for the last 30, 40 years, the orientation of government policy making since actually the latter part of the Marcos dictatorship is shrink government and then let businesses do what they may. The problem there is, again, kaya pati pinag-uusapan, no country has developed over the long term without the government creating a legal regulatory infrastructure with the long-term view in mind. So parang the shrinking of the Philippine government, and despite our seemingly bloated bureaucracy, we have actually one of the smallest, we're like the bottom 1/4 in the world in terms of government employees per capita or in terms of government expenditures. So we're actually, I know it seems like we have such a bloated government. We actually have quite an emaciated government. And again, tama kayo. If the government orientation is not towards the public service, the long-term good, the collective welfare, mangyari talaga dyan, mag-shrink siya, magkakanya-kanya, and even the thinking within government, either they're going to be pro-business in terms of the businesses they're from. If you're a power firm, papasok ka sa gobyerno because you want your generation assets to make money. You don't want Philippine electricity to be cheap. You want your generation interest to actually make money. So parang may corruption, may diminution of the potential of government by that unfortunate lack of long-term vision, and even worse, capture by certain corporate interests of the government machinery.
Okay, let's go for a quick break, Sonny, and when we come back, please give us solutions, suggestions, because first, okay, I've been talking, media people have been writing about the food crisis, food inflation, and now this topic of living wages, because we either may come up with a lot of very affordable basic commodities, or we increase the wages, which we will also speak to Secretary Laguesma about. But we'll go for a quick break. We'll be right back here on Agenda. Living wages we're talking about, and there is now a push from labor groups to increase salaries because they cannot afford to buy basic commodities with the basic salary being paid now. With us, Executive Director of the IBON Foundation, Mr. Sonny Africa. Sonny, welcome back. Let's continue our conversation. You've more or less explained concepts, practices, but here in the Philippines, what can we do?
Okay. Regarding wages in particular po, Sir Cito?
Everything. I mean,
Okay.
kasi option one, increase wages. Other people, ideally, not just basic, kung di ba, meron tayong basic wage, sinasabi, yung iba sinasabi, living wage. What quick solutions can you give before we go to Secretary Laguesma?
Sige. Sa amin, it's so basic po eh. If the reality is that corporations are increasing their profitability on the back of improving worker productivity, it's a no-brainer that the workers should have a share of that increase in productivity in terms of higher wages. Unfortunately, even before the pandemic, but of course made worse by the pandemic, under the Duterte administration, wages did not even keep up with the rising prices of goods and services. Actually, also being replicated right now under the Marcos Jr. administration. So sa amin, the most basic thing is come from a realization, can workers afford to live on their wage? Clearly, they can't. Our own computation, the family living wage is about 1,133. We are so wondering why the NWPC stopped computing the family living wage. I mean, it's the most basic thing sana. I mean, if the Department of Labor is going to stand up for labor, it should continue actually its own computations of the family living wage, but they stopped that. Pero para sa amin, as a benchmark for what the workers should be receiving, it should be the family living wage, and then put the burden of proof on employers to say if they can afford it or not. Because one thing we realized when we do help out with the labor groups when they negotiate with the NWPC, for some reason, the burden seems to be always on the worker to prove that the employer can afford it. Para sa amin, after this long, drawn-out problem of real wages falling over the last 15 years, dapat i-shift yun. Maybe it will be better for the government to take the side of the workers and then help the workers get a justification from the employers if they can afford it or not. And I think that will nudge up wages upward somehow, that will somehow increase purchasing power, increase more money in the economy, and I think help not just worker families, but also help the communities they're in, the informal self-employed in their communities, and sort of get a bit, spur a bit more economic recovery instead of it being concentrated in the hands of a few corporations. Last point then po, it's so amazing that in the face of this pandemic, in the face of falling real wages, we did a quick check of executive pay. Executive pay has been increasing in the last 2 years. I mean, that's not even to talk about oligarch wealth. So para sa amin, it seems that if executive compensation can increase, if their benefits and basic salaries can increase, siguro naman a little bit of a higher increase can be afforded for their workers.
Maybe that should be your next project, a survey assessment of salaries paid to officials in government in relation to salaries paid to employees in outside of government. Anyway, Sonny Africa, thank you very much again. Stick around. You can listen to our next guest, and maybe you can pick up a few things. Thank you for your time today, Sonny Africa.
Thanks, Sir Cito. Good luck with your piano lessons.
Okay. Let's now go to our next guest, my beloved friend, the Honorable Secretary of the Department of Labor, three-time reigning champion ng DOLE, Secretary Benny Laguesma. Good morning.
Magandang umaga, Cito, at magandang umaga po sa inyong mga taga-subaybay at taga-tangkilik. Maraming salamat po sa pagkakataon.
Okay, check lang natin bakit hindi pumapasok si Sir sa video. But anyway, Sec Benny, as you already know, our topic is connected, or involves yung call ng labor groups na please naman, parang awa, taasan nyo na yung mga sweldo, hindi na kaya. And even the Philippine Statistics Authority has recognized that inflation has hit. Even food inflation is finally being reported. What can the DOLE, I know that you can only move within your area of responsibility. What is your reaction or thoughts? What are your thoughts about this?
Tito, una, hindi naman kailangan magmakaawa ang atin pong mga manggagawa kasi bahagi po ng mandate ng National Wages and Productivity Commission. Ganon din naman po yung mga existing na regional tripartite and wages productivity boards na ang kanilang tungkulin hindi natatapos sa pagpapalabas lamang ng wage order. Tuloy-tuloy po dapat yung kanilang pag-aaral, pagsubaybay at isang mahalagang component ng kanila pong responsibilidad ay tiyakin na yung mga lumalabas na wage order sa pamamagitan ng pakikipag-ugnayan sa atin pong mga regional offices ay napapatupad at nasusundan. Ang last round po ng wage adjustment, Cito, ay nangyari lamang noong Hunyo. At batay po doon sa tala na naipaabot sa aking kaalaman, out of the 16 regional tripartite wages and productivity boards, 4 po doon yung one time, 12 sa mga boards ay mayroong tinatawag na second tranche. No? So some of these boards will have the second tranche next month, the others January up to April yung iba. So ito po yung isa sa mga konsiderasyon kung bakit kailangan din ng balance, yung pong balance medyo mahirap, hindi po ganun kadali dahil sa ilalim po ng batas mayroon pong mga factors na sinasabing dapat tinitignan kung tayo po ay magkakaroon ng adjustment. Isa po dyan, yung may kinalaman dito sa inflation na dulot din naman yan ng mga prices ng basic commodities at saka yung po tinatawag din natin na consumer price index. At alam ko po na medyo emotional at saka sensitibo ang usapin, lalo na may kinalaman sa karagdagan ng sweldo. At dapat po kasi tinitingnan hindi lamang yung pangangailangan ng ating pong mga manggagawa at kanilang pamilya, yun din pong kakayahan ng mga business establishments sapagkat batid mo naman na Cito, ang majority po ng ating mga business establishments nandun po sa kategorya na micro and small enterprises.
Correct.
At ito po yung tinamaan ng husto nito pong ongoing na pandemic at ang amin pong direksyon ngayon, subukan na makatulong sa kanila sapagkat bagamat nakakakita tayo ng mga karagdagang hanap buhay o mga employment opportunities. Doon sa latest na tala ng PSA, ay medyo nag-improve ang atin pong employment rate. Pero nakikita namin sa Department of Labor and Employment, Cito, medyo mataas pa rin yung bilang ng mga underemployed, yung mga naghahanap ng karagdagang trabaho o karagdagang oras ng trabaho na medyo hindi nila nakikita. Secondly, nakita namin na karamihan dun sa mga nalikhang trabaho na napasukan po ng ating mga manggagawa, nandun po sa kategorya ng lower paying, lower skills category, at yan po ang hamon sa amin, quality of employment. So ito po yung mga pinag-uukulan ng pansin ng Department of Labor and Employment. And today, Cito, meron po kaming isasagawang konferensya may kinalaman sa productivity, labor productivity. Dahil napansin ko nga po nung aking pag-upo sa akin pong unang meeting with the National Wages and Productivity Commission, ay akin pong itinanong ang mandate ng NWPC at ng mga boards ay may kinalaman sa wages at saka sa productivity. Hindi tayo dapat na nakatuon lamang doon sa usapin na dagdag ng sweldo.
Hindi yung tawaran at yung formula lang ang dapat sundin. Dapat kung ano yung mga nakaka-apekto rin.
Tama yon, Cito. Hindi naman pwede na nakatingin ka doon sa isang fixed na formula pero merong mga ibang mga factors na dapat mong tignan at kaya nga merong wage fixing on the regional basis kasi gusto mong mag-induce ng employment sa mga rural areas, makatulong ka na magkaroon doon ng employment generation nang hindi na magmamigrate po ang ating mga manggagawa.
Anong nasilip mo, Sec Benny? Kasi sabi mo may nakita ka. Ano yung nasilip mo sa mga wage boards? Ano yung hindi mo nagustuhan or dapat ayusin? Dapat ayusin yung pagsabayin ang pagtingin na pag-aasikaso may kinalaman din sa labor productivity at capital productivity. Kasi saan pa bang gagalingan ng mga karagdagang benepisyo? No? Kung year in, year out, ang tinitignan lang natin karagdagang sweldo, subalit hindi natin pinag-uukulan ng pansin, paano rin ba tayo makakatulong sa mga maliliit na negosyo nang sa ganon, kung mayroon pong inilalabas na wage order, hindi sila magpapile ng exemption.
Kasi inaalaw Cito yung exemption kung merong inilabas, and this becomes very frustrating and disappointing sa ating mga manggagawa pag merong mga nai-exempt, kasi hindi naman sila exempted sa pagtaas ng presyo ng bilihin. Bakit sila magiging exempt, no?
Hindi sila exempted sa withholding tax.
Correct. Yun Cito, no? Yun maaaring sa tingin parang masyadong simplistic na pagtanaw para sa akin. Pero tingin ko dapat laging may koneksyon ang usapin sa karagdagang benepisyo sa pagtaas din ng level ng ating productivity, kasi ito rin naman ang tinitignan ng mga investors o mga nais maglagak ng puhunan sa Pilipinas. Gaano ba natin makikita ang tinatawag natin na fair return and equitable return ng ating investment, at the same time not disregarding na dapat nating alagaan ang ating pong mga manggagawa.
Okay, I know, no, alam ko na yung inyong sakop ay yung mga manggagawa, mga employer, pero you said productivity several times and many companies always talk about productivity. Tayo ba sa DOLE o kayo ba sa DOLE, mino-monitor ba ng maigi, lalo na mga wage boards, na yung actual na productivity? Kasi nakakayamot yung bang, alam mo, nasa media ko, ang dami kong nadidinig ng mga representante ng ganitong grupo, chamber, association, na iyak ng iyak, basta may nagsabing taasan ng sweldo, ngangawa sila, iiyak sila, at sasabing malulugi kami, pag pinataas nyo sweldo, magbabawas kami ng empleyado. Akala nila na lahat kami sa media nakakalimot. Pagdating ng January, February, biglang maglalabas sila ng kanilang mga glowing report na they earn 10%, 20% year on year. Sabi ko, mga damuhong sabi nila malulugi, pero ito milyon-milyon o bilyon ang kinita. Does the DOLE, the wage boards, do they monitor pa? Kasi pagdating dun sa negotiation, you're presuming integrity and honesty on both sides. Yung pala, hindi naman natin alam kung talagang ito lang ba ang productivity level ng kumpanyang ito. Tapos sasabihin, hindi, lugi ho kami. Paano masasabing lugi? Nagbayad ka sa BIR, ganito karami, binayaran mong profit.
Cito, yun yung isa sa mga nakita ko na dapat bigyan ng masusing pansin. No? Kasi mayroong mandate may kinalaman diyan Hindi, kaya nga ulitin ko lang, hindi natatapos ang trabaho ng wage boards, no? Pagkatapos na magpalabas ng wage order, dapat tuloy-tuloy. In fact, doon sa batas na lumikha nitong wage rationalization na sistema, meron diyang requirement na taon-taon dapat nagbibigay sa kanila ng ulat, ng report, yung mga employers na maaaring naapektuhan, yung binabanggit mo. Sabi nila kasi dahil sa wage order nyo, nagbawas kami ng tao. Dapat makita natin iyon. Meron tayong talagang accurate na informasyon dahil yun ang panggagalingan ng ating plan of action. Yun ang panggagalingan ng government intervention. Paano ba natin may iwasan na paulit-ulit yan na nadidinig natin? Pag pinag-uusapan ng usapin sa pagdagdag ng sweldo, ang kagad nadidinig natin, pag nagdagdag ng sweldo, malulugi, magbabawas ng tao, magsasara, magbabawas ng oras ng trabaho. Sana medyo gumraduate na tayo doon sa ganung klaseng mga usapan. Ang pag-usapan natin, paano ba natin kung may lalabas na ganito, ano ba ang pwede nating maging course of action nang hindi naman nasasakripisyo ang interes ng mga namumuhunan, pero hindi pinapabayaan at hindi winawalang bahala. Yun po namang mga concerns na legitimate ng atin pong mga manggagawa at ng kanilang pamilya.
Okay, so ang reporting system ay doon sa mga nagbabawas ng tao for whatever reason. Pero meron ba kayong reporting or monitoring system, or are you going to make that requirement to determine companies that declared profit and how much profit versus companies that declared losses?
Cito, merong reporting requirement, pero gusto kong tignan personally, ano ba yung mga items na nakapaloob doon sa format na yon, no? Makakakuha pa kami doon ng impormasyon, may kinalaman dito sa binabanggit mo. Ano ang level ng produktibidad ng isang kumpanya at bakit hindi niya ibinabalik yung karampatan na, yung sabi ko, shared responsibility, sharing also ng fruits of labor ng ating pong mga manggagawa. So, hindi ko pa individual na natignan kung ano yung reporting, anong kinakapture, anong nakukuhang impormasyon doon sa reporting. Pero may requirement, Cito. At ikalawa, gusto ko ring sabihin na hindi lang diyan matatapos, yan ay dapat din namin na i-disseminate dun sa aming mga tinatawag na labor inspectors. At ang mga labor inspectors, hindi lamang sila dapat na mag-ukol ng pansin kung hindi nagbayad ng tamang sweldo. Dapat tignan din nila tama ba ang mga kalakaran o mga pagtupad sa occupational safety and health. Pangalawa, ano ba ang importanteng makita nila may kinalaman sa compliance sa mga nilalabas na wage orders ng ating pong mga regional tripartite and wages productivity boards.
Okay, kasi kailangan natin ng data to make correct and appropriate policy. Last question ko na lang sa iyo, Sec Benny, para makapunta ka na dyan sa napakahalagang conference na yan. Dapat niyaya mo ko eh. Okay, anyway. Itong binanggit kasi kanina ng kakampi natin si Sonny Africa, bakit daw hindi na parang pinagpapansin yung family living wage category? Parang wala na sa computation or consideration yun.
Yun nga po rin ang isang gusto kong maintindihan, Cito, no? Kasi siguro naman bigyan lang kami ng konting panahon din kasi bagamat pang-limang buwan na namin ngayon, Cito, marami din kaming mga inasikasong ilang mga bagay kasama na itong ating pong budget para sa 2023. Gusto namin tiyakin na meron pong sasapat na pondo para sa mga programa ng Department of Labor and Employment may kinalaman sa pagtulong sa mga manggagawa. Yan po isa. Pangalawa, tayo po ay katatapos lamang na mag-host nung atin pong tinatawag na ASEAN Labor Ministers Meeting nung nakaraang buwan po, last week po ng Oktubre. At tayo po ngayon ang tumatayong chairman Pilipinas. Actually, Pilipinas, nagkataon lamang ang Secretary ng Labor si Bienvenido Laguesma. Kaya siya ngayon ang chairman ng ASEAN Labor Ministers Meeting. At for the next 2 years, tayo po ang gagabay doon sa ating mga kasamahan sa ASEAN. At gusto kong samantalahin o kaya ay medyo i-maximize ang pagiging chair person ng Pilipinas para tignan kung paano natin palakasin ang atin po namang ikangay pakikipagnayan sa kanila. At patuto rin naman tayo dahil hindi naman tayo may monopolidad ng kaalaman sa larangan ng paggawa at paghanap buhay, no? So we can learn especially from the experiences of Singapore, at medyo open sila, may kinalaman din sa aming pagnanais na talagang yung programa ng Department of Labor and Employment in relation to digitalization matulungan po tayo ng Singapore nang sa ganon medyo mabilis tayong makapag-produce ng mga data, hindi yung manual, mga isang linggo na nalipasan na tayo ng gutom, Cito, hindi pa dumadating yung impormasyon, no? Medyo sa ating edad ngayon, medyo mainipin na tayo sa pagkilos pagka ganon. Gusto natin makita na sana bukas, nandyan na, para na sa ganon, bukas, meron na rin tayong balangkas ng plano. Paano ba natin i-address yung issue? Lalo na may kinalaman ito sa world of work, yung atin pong employers at saka workers, dapat po talaga nagagabayan natin. At hindi naman dapat na tayo nakikita na parang regulator lamang. Dapat tayo enabler at saka being able to provide them appropriate courses of action with the assistance of government. Yan po yung mga prioridad natin na gustong maisagawa sa mga darating na maikling panahon.
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary Bienvenido Laguesma. Alam kong medyo rush ka this morning, pero please come back to the program pag may mga nakita ka ng dapat malathala dyan sa conference na yan. And let's talk again on how we can improve things even better. Thank you very much, sir. God bless you.
Maraming salamat, Cito, at mabuhay po ang inyong programa.
Okay, I'm po Secretary Bienvenido Laguesma, and he is a good friend and one of the government officials that I have long admired and respected. Let's now go to our closing prayer blessing for the day. As we close the program, we leave you with this week's blessing from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. I urge you, first of all, to pray for all people, pati na yung mga anak nyo, pamangkin nyo, pinsan, kapitbahay. Ask God to help them, intercede on their behalf, and give thanks for them. Pray this way for kings and all who are in authority. Yan po, mahalaga. Let's do that so that as we bless others with our prayers, we ourselves are blessed. I'm Cito Beltran, thanking you for joining us today. And please, hope to meet you tomorrow. Please keep it here on One News.